So good morning. I'm happy to welcome you to the second panel of today's program, Steering Toward the Omega Point, Evolution, Consciousness and Altruism. I'll be the moderator of this panel. I'm Henrietta, and I work for an online educational program around holistic subjects at the Evolver social network, the learning lab there. Dr. David Sloan Wilson, if you'd like to give a brief introduction and a framing introduction, and then I'll introduce the panelists here.
Okay, great. Well, our first panel was, we had a wonderful time, and now I'm looking forward to our second panel. The text for the day is my book, Does Altruism Exist? And what that book does is it reports on developments in evolutionary science, which is very favorable towards the holistic and spiritual view that most of the people in this event today on this panel and all of the panels have already articulated in their own ways and from their various traditions. And in some ways, I think my field of evolutionary science is catching up to that vision. I'm the Johnny-come-lately. And yet at the same time, the integration of the science and of the philosophical and spiritual traditions, of course, there's much work to be done. And so without further ado, I think if you could introduce our panelists, we can dive right in.
Absolutely. Okay, great. So we have Dr. John Thatalamil, who is the Associate Professor of Theology and World Religions at Union Theological Seminary. Dr. Anne Klaeysen, in second position there, clergy leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, our hosts here today. We have Doug King, who is president of Presence, an integral think tank on the future of religion. Richard Bowell, author and integral thought leader from the Center for Human Evolutionary Change. And Reverend Deborah Moldow, founder of Garden of Light and representative to the United Nations of the World Peace Prayer Society. So this panel has been presented with the three questions as before, framing the importance of altruism in the process of evolution, design principles for global change based on altruism, and concerning this global emergence of a heart or higher intuitive intelligence. So we'll start with you, please, John. Thank you.
It's great to be here in such an august company. I'm grateful also to learn something about the Society of Ethical Culture, our hosts. First of all, let me say that David's book is an astonishing intellectual feat for the sheer range and variety of fields it covers, including evolutionary biology, religion, economics, politics, and many other fields besides. Any way of speaking about such a large intellectual project is bound to miss a great deal, and that's why everyone should just buy the book and read it. With that coda, let me offer a few thoughts. As a philosopher and as a theologian, I have long been weary of the incessant battles between atheists, particularly the new atheists, and their imagined opponents, who are often characterized by people like Richard Dawkins as a scientifically illiterate, intellectually challenged group of fundamentalists. The animus against religion in general, and Islam in particular, an astonishing number of the new atheists are manifestly Islamophobic, is, I think, an impediment to a richer and fuller conversation that we might be having between the sciences and religion, and particularly evolutionary theory and religion. I am tired of the arguments that all religion is bad, but one is especially so. David's book is blessedly free of such simplistic, reductionistic, and dismissive attitudes towards religious traditions. The real questions he would have us foreground are about how religious thinkers, and just about anyone else committed to altruism, might collaborate toward generating deeper measures of altruism in communities at every level. That is the pressing concern and challenge, and not a time and energy depleting battle between scientistic fundamentalists on the one side and religious fundamentalists on the other. So I think we owe David a profound debt of gratitude for showing us how to move beyond that kind of zero-sum battle. I hope we can talk about that on the panel. Also at the heart of David's book, and this is for me a tremendously important issue as a philosopher and as a theologian, is the book's call for us to begin to think organically rather than atomistically. Just about anything we stop to think about turns out not to be a simplistic atomistic substance, but a society or an organism. That is true at every level of reality. I think that claim is integral to David's book. I read David's work as part of a larger shift away from thinking of reality as composed of isolated substances or monads that may contingently, if convenient, interact with other monads. That view of reality has come to plague much Western thinking, and I think is fundamentally false. And David's attention to groups as complex organisms is an immensely important corrective. Here I'm struck by the resonance between David's work and the recent work of Kriti Sharma, a microbiologist at UNC Chapel Hill. In her book, Interdependence, Biology and Beyond, she writes, "By and large, we think that interdependence just means independent objects interacting. We say things interact strongly, weakly, reciprocally, sequentially, and so on, but their ultimate independence from one another remains intact." Against this view, she argues for a fundamentally different and new step. Quote, "To get to a thoroughgoing view of interdependence, she believes we must move from thinking of things in interaction to considering things as mutually constituted. That is, as viewing things as existing only due to their dependence on other things." I think that's a wonderful way of integrating many of the philosophical themes that I see as underlying David's book. And I think making that shift is a profoundly important move for us. Finally, a note just on the notion of heart wisdom. I think that is fundamentally an important notion. I prefer to speak about binocular wisdom, the capacity to see the world through more than one set of intellectual lenses. In my case, usually more than one set of religious traditions, and to integrate into one what is seen thereby. And I think really this needs to happen across religious traditions, but it also needs to happen between religious traditions and scientific communities. Showing us just how we might get there is a profound contribution of David's book, and I'm immensely grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John. So, Anne.
Yes, okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Well, I also very much appreciate your book, and I appreciate the respect that you show for the layperson. I think I told David earlier that I have a certain exposure through my college education to statistics and science and sociology and biology, etc. But I'm aware that there's a great deal here that I don't understand. And so what I appreciate about this so much is this is a book that's written for everyone. This is for all of us. And it's written in terms that even I can understand. And I think that's so important because ethical culture was founded by Dr. Felix Adler, who was a philosopher. He taught at Columbia University, and indeed his son, Horace Freese, started the religion department at Columbia. And he often said that religion must benefit from the discoveries of science. And this is such a wonderful example of that, in the ways in which we can benefit from pulling all these different pieces together. So I want to appreciate you for that. John, you mentioned the New Atheist, and I have a bone to pick with them as well. And I think part of it is, I think that they don't often, and I know some of them, I don't feel that their behavior is respectful. And for me, as much as I respect Dr. Wilson's book in presenting these concepts so that we can understand them, I would appreciate from the new atheist some respect for other people's perspectives, and also a deeper understanding of what religion is. And it's very easy philosophically, in fact it's an old philosophical trick, to create a straw man, imbue that straw man with all the things that you disagree with, and then knock it down. And that doesn't show the kind of intellectual humility and moral imagination that one needs when one addresses this kind of discussion. So for that, I'm really happy that my friend Robert Wright has a series of lectures at Union Theological on the new agnosticism. And I really feel that that's a really good contribution to this whole movement. I want to backtrack a little bit and talk about ethical culture. It was founded in 1876 by Felix Adler, who at the time was only 25 years old. And he was very radical in as much as he started a new religion, a non-theistic religion of ethics. But in some ways, he was a person of his time, because the social gospel movement was out there. And so he connected it to social justice. So we have both a philosophical perspective. He referred to something called the ethical manifold, or the organic ideal. And philosophically, it really fits so well with this concept of altruism and evolution, the whole notion of evolution, in as much as he imagined that there was sort of this manifold, meaning many, as opposed to Ralph Waldo Emerson's oversoul, meaning a unity or one. And diversity in that was very important, that every particle of this organic ideal needed one another. And that comes to play later when he talks about spiritual pains. After World War I, he experienced, as did everyone around the world, such devastation and the realization of what humanity was capable of doing to one another. He said, we have to really reconstruct our whole notion of what spirituality is. So we need a reconstruction of a spiritual ideal. And he mentioned in there 3 spiritual pains that I think are really relevant to what we're talking about today. The first was the human experience of feeling insignificant in a huge universe. I'm just one person, and how could I possibly be of any significance? The second one is feeling overwhelmed by the great need in the world. If you are awake and aware, you know of the great need in the world. And how do I address myself to that? And that sense of just being overwhelmed, what could I possibly do? And perhaps even feeling paralyzed by it. And the third is having a divided conscience. And so often we experience that. We know people, maybe even ourselves, have experienced being in a position where we want to do one thing and yet we are conflicted. We need to put food on the table, a roof over our head, education for our children. How do we reconcile that? And so what he did, and I think it has so much in concert with altruism, he said, first of all, recognizing that even though we are small, we are not insignificant, we are unique and irreplaceable, and actually necessary to the universe. I love that notion that we are necessary to the universe. The second piece about being overwhelmed is we can't do everything, but we can do something. And we can do something with other people in social groups. When he was once asked, why don't you have a sacred text? He said, well, we practice our religion in social groups. How better to learn how to be an ethical person than to be interacting in a group, get the feedback from someone else about your behavior, and then act in a better way, putting deed above creed. Lastly, the divided conscience is what he calls the supreme ethical rule. Act in ways that elicit the goodness in others. And when you do that, you elicit the best in yourself as well.
Thank you very much, Anne. So, Doug, we'll hear from you next.
Thank you, Henrietta.
Thanks.
Appreciate that very much, and thanks to everyone who made this event possible. We are very much pleased to have this opportunity to participate in this global conversation. Our group is called Presence, and in fact, our tagline is a global conversation for a new earth. And we've talked about altruism and how it's affected by groups. Groups certainly are formed by boundaries, and boundary-driven thinking is often a problem, and boundary conflicts arise from that in terms of the way we're trying to evolve together as humans. The audience that we're addressing in our work is not the religious audience, but the ever-growing group called the spiritual but not religious. And our discussions with that group is to make sure that, first of all, we can offer an opportunity to look at a narrative, and we come from the biblical narrative, without jettisoning narratives and still thinking in terms of whether a narrative is pointing us to universal, common, spiritual space, so that we do not attach to a specific narrative, but rather the conversation becomes, what does each narrative point to? What are the aspects of that space? Ultimate reality, God, Brahman, Advaita, etc. What is that space? Because that is where we will then begin to talk about altruism, that which we do on behalf of others, from a universal perspective. So in the biblical narrative, if I'm talking to somebody who's spiritual but not religious, I'll start with Father Abraham as a symbol of someone who is moving out on the basis of faith, not a self-centered movement. That would really be more the metaphor of Adam, but rather someone who is feeling a call to the future. And the promise of the future is evolution. That's what this is about. So Abraham's all about evolution. And the promise to Abraham was that someday all nations of the earth would be blessed. So we asked the question, what would be the blessing of all the nations? What is that? And how does that evolve through the narrative? Now I get to see how spiritual evolutionary consciousness is taking place actually through history, from the tribal to the feudal to the traditional to the modern, postmodern, and now into what I would understand to be integral or all in all God space. And so when I get to the teachings of Jesus, I'll find that he is modeling a death to self-centeredness, that his action is altruistic because it's to model on behalf of aspects of life, even though there is no benefit to him, and in fact there's great loss in what it is that he has to sacrifice. And then I come to followers such as Paul, who come from a tribe called Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. Well, that's very boundary driven. It has to do with ethnicity, it has to do with culture, it has to do with his religious background. But here he is as his consciousness evolves, and he stands in this beautiful place in the world called the Acropolis. He is at the Areopagus, and he's standing there far away from that little tribal consciousness that he had, and he's saying to them, God has made of one blood all nations. Now Paul is moving to that global, universal, spiritual consciousness. And when we get to the revelation of a new heaven and a new earth, we believe that's the space in which we all reside today, is in a new heaven and a new earth space. The question is, to what degree are each of us conscious of that? And when we get to that new heaven and earth space, we find that there is the metaphor of Jerusalem evolving from that which is geographical, that which is dominated by religious contention, and that goes back to groups and boundary-driven thinking, that which is ethnic, and that which also supersedes gender. So Paul will say there's neither male nor female, there's neither Jew nor Greek, etc. And when you get to this new heaven and earth thinking, altruism becomes evolved to where the entirety of humanity is one group, which we might call now an organism. So even though there's differentiation within this body human, it is not differentiation based on group competition, but rather in concert with. And so when we move to trans-narrative space, which is the space that we see as new heaven and earth space, we're moving to an all-nations approach. So the New Jerusalem, which we believe is a metaphor for where we are today, is the next step in evolution. Not because there was no need for the first way of thinking, but because it was the necessary steps to get us to this place. There is no denigration of religion. There's simply the question of, are there better ways to think and perhaps evolve? And these are questions that are going to have to be addressed in our opinion. And so in that sense, we're saying then that we're moving then to one group, and within that New Jerusalem, we've transcended geography, we have transcended boundary-driven thinking, and we have transcended those things that can cause disputes. Again, where there are no boundaries, there can be no boundary disputes. So that is the way that we're addressing altruism, if you will, and it enables, in a group sense, for us to all act on behalf of each other because we are each other. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Doug. And Richard, we'd like to hear from you now.
I see that we humans are evolution's experiment. And whether it turns out well or not, for the conscious person, that's not the issue. The issue that I face even right here, right now, is can I release myself into some function that furthers what those evolutionary principles might propose? I think altruism is a rather unfortunate word because, and I hear it in the language today, that the suggestion that we may want a better world or want certain things for others, but the level of self that wants things for others inevitably becomes coercive on others to join our version of that better world. So, David, I have to apologise to you. I live on a Greek island. Not only haven't I read your book, but Rocky 2 only just came out last week, and I have no internet. My focus is on this system, the temple or the template. And what I see from a deep observation of self is that all evolutionary process is benefit, is profit. This idea that in an altruistic world we're calculating whether helping others may, in that investment, may in time pay back and benefit us is an endless calculation that has brought government and banking and every other mechanism of society to a stop. Because when, as I have seen it in myself, that when I give away from that highest point I can find in my own response, that always benefit comes. Your word, Doug, light or blessing, glory. I call it the beginning of illuminated sequences. And the process of this that is perhaps hinted at by many people here today is that in some way the breakdown, or as I call it, the sublimation of self, is what allows the future to find us. And there are parallels in nature. I think a flower sublimates its higher part in the smell and the, I've lost my English, effulgence, the passing of the scent that draws the bee to the flower. I think the highest level of love that I have seen, felt, been close to is the sublimation of self, that knows that in sublimating self, something always joins the person, always illuminates the person. It's that is the integrating principle. It sends fear through my system that we think we are integrating the world, that we are integrating religions. It has been given to this human template to be granted a new permission of thought and meaning that comes from why we do what we do. No conscious act that begins in knowing why or affirming the why, that we translate through the meaning of self in how we do what we do. It never fails to contribute meaningfully in what we do. And for those who talk about higher brain development, I believe that evolution is showing us a way to rewire our brain from the standpoint of affirming an evolutionary principle. So in short, what is consciousness? It is affirming why in this time afresh that leads to the significant contribution towards a new world. Now, when I hear others who come fresh from that, I know that when I hear it coming from the same thing from giants like yourself and our conversation yesterday and Doug and others, I know that somehow we are coming to the same thing. I just want to put in a caution of this intellectual academia that suggests that we are integrating religions and the future. There is a new start hope present right here amongst us that is very, very exciting to be amongst. I'm not representing an organization, I'm a human in the experiment right now. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks indeed. And Deborah, we'd like to hear from you last of all.
Thank you. Yesterday, I saw a photograph of two lovely gray whales that were found beached with their stomachs filled with plastic. We are in dire straits. Dr. Wilson's book, Does Altruism Exist?, opens an important conversation at this critical moment here on planet Earth. There is ample evidence of altruistic behavior where an individual acts for the benefit of a group as long as she or he is strongly identified with that group, be it family, tribe, school, platoon, religion, or nation. But the game has changed now, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If humanity does not begin to recognize itself as a global community that includes not only every person, but also every component of a web of interconnected life on a living planet in a living universe, we are likely to see ourselves extinguished in the current wave that's known as the sixth great extinction. And yet, we see so clearly in the politics of our own country that such an expansion of consciousness does not come easily to a population entrenched in long-held beliefs. An evolutionary leap in human consciousness is needed to propel us to make the changes necessary to address the growing crisis of climate change, which carries with it major challenges to peace and environmental sustainability. And those are areas in which we have not yet achieved anything close to the progress that everybody claims to want. So Dr. Wilson is wise to focus on Dr. Eleanor Ostrom,'s design principles for building institutions to manage common pool resources on an architecture of trust and justice. Nations and regions without these elements in their governance and in their civil society life are collapsing under current stresses already. And rising sea levels and erratic weather patterns will only make the crises more terrifying and more widespread. As Dr. Wilson puts it, now we are at a point in history when the great problem of human life is to accomplish functional organization at a larger scale than ever. We cannot wait for natural selection. He concludes that we must become planetary altruists. However, Dr. Ostrom's design principles are optimized when they are developed cooperatively at the most local level. Can they be successfully scaled up? At the international level, the United Nations has striven for 70 years to bring its member states into agreement. Yet disarmament and sustainability still seem a long way off, as national interest continually trumps global concerns. So, what must we do to awaken the planetary altruism that Dr. Wilson prescribes? How can we steer a Titanic-scale multinational culture that has flourished based largely on individual ambition toward actions that will at least offer the possibility for human life to continue on this beautiful earth for 7 generations into the future? We need not only a massive transformation of consciousness, but also the expanded creativity and innovation to address the issues facing us. We, all of us who are already informed, caring global citizens, we still drive cars and discard plastic containers because we're enmeshed in a way of life that is heading for the iceberg. And even that metaphor will soon be extinct. But there is a piece of encouraging news. The evolutionary leap that we require is already happening. We don't know how to save the whales, but we do care about them and we do feel their loss. We care about the victims of wars and disasters on the other side of the world. The heart of Europe opened to admit hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Middle East, unprecedented for such traditionally closed societies. So will this evolution of the heart open into a new phase of human development? Perhaps the one that the integral thinkers call the second tier? There is an emerging global spirituality that transcends the diversity of religious practice and that is coalescing our common values. This evolutionary leap is spiritual, it is monumental, and like the rising sea, it cannot be stopped. So thank you all for your part in it, and may peace prevail on earth.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was wonderful. A really great discussion on this panel. And I was just, reminded what it was making me think of was this panel is like a pod of dolphins, that sort of collective intelligence with everybody bringing a different skill to this experiment, as Richard was saying, sort of right here, right now, the real treat. And so now I'd like to invite you all to join in a discussion with Dr. Sloan. And,
yes,
Dr.
another
Wilson.
feast that we have only 20 minutes to discuss. And I wanted to begin with Richard and to agree that altruism is an unfortunate word, as strange as it might seem given the title of my book. But if you read the book, you know that actually I very quickly, as soon as I possibly can, move the center of the conversation to groups as organisms, basically, and groups as functional units. And I point out that altruism is a new word coined by only in this 19th century by another philosopher who was trying to do a bit what Felix Adler was trying to do and failed. We must say, and I think that the word altruism is atomistic. That's part of its problem. I think that's one of the things you said, which connects to what John was saying, and that we do need to be more systemic, and that individuals see themselves as part of a system and part of a process, and what they have to work for is for the whole process, including themselves, to thrive. So I want to, first of all, take your point that it is a problematic word. And also, while we're being pluralistic, as we all are, we have to be pluralistic about our vocabularies and that we're using the same words in different ways. There's no way to get around that. So when I say altruism, what people are going to hear is going to be refracted through their respective meaning systems. And we're always going to have to work to be multilingual and not to assume that that your meaning is my meaning for any of these key words. Then that to be appropriately multilingual is very difficult, and that's a big problem in my own field. Just the scientific usage of the word altruism requires being multilingual. That brings us to the new atheists, and I'm talking too much here. I wanted to bring us back to the new atheists, and just to kick it off, I think that what I've done, what I try to do, is always to say that you might or might not be religious, but you always have a meaning system. Every human has a meaning system, something cultural, which is required to organize experience. Everything from perception through the processing of information leading to action. And so to focus on meaning systems, which might or might not be religious, that's the human universal. And so if I could just invite more comments, because that was clearly a major topic, and then let's have a little more conversation about that. Then I want to turn the conversations to groups that work. But let's have about 5 minutes of conversation on meaning systems, and religion as one kind of meaning system. Who would like to begin?
I'll jump in because as you were talking about the definition of altruism, I immediately thought about the definition of religion because ethical culture is a non-theistic religion of ethics, very similar to Buddhism. So we put the emphasis not on belief but on behavior. And when we try to put that out there, we get, especially from the new atheists, we get the pushback of no, this religion is the worship of a supernatural deity. And I say, well, read past that first definition, and why don't we be a little more, understanding of what the reality on the ground is. So I think language is indeed, and vocabulary is indeed a great impediment, especially when you deal with people who don't want to open up to the possibility that there might be other definitions. So another thing that I appreciate about your book is the sense that you say we need to come at it from different perspectives. We need to understand that there are different perspectives here, and you're bringing up the issue about paradigms. So people operate in different paradigms. So the paradigm that I'm working in is that it is possible to be religious and to not worship a supernatural being, but rather to see, SBNR, spiritual but not religious, to see one's spirituality in the relationships among and between people. So to me, what is sacred and what is holy is the way that I treat other people. And the way that I help as a leader here to organize our activities, to organize our programming, towards that end.
Great. John?
I've been influenced by the work of one of my teachers, Peter Berger, who is a sociologist of religion. And Berger actually argues on evolutionary grounds that human beings have become the kind of creatures who are unspecified by birth to any particular local environment. That is, the evolutionary processes themselves have generated a creature that doesn't have a tight fit to a particular local place.
That's true.
And it's precisely that impulse that has generated a creature that wants to know where it is, but where it is no longer local. But as some of the language that's been used earlier, even cosmic. That is, we want to know where we are on the largest possible scale. And I do think a sort of truth-seeking orientation is generated thereby. I think that's one of the functions of religion. My own language is that to be religious is to seek comprehensive qualitative orientation. Comprehensive is about scale. Qualitative is about the nature of our being here, such that we can attune our affect appropriately. What is worth desiring? Should I adopt an attitude of resignation or investment? Those kinds of questions about what it means to orient our desiring rightly at a comprehensive scale is what I take it means to be religious. And I agree with you that figuring out some sense of comprehensive qualitative orientation is a human, evolutionarily driven project, and no one evades it.
If I could insert, basically, that first of all, it's very eloquent, and both of you. But what a meaning system has to do is result in action.
Correct.
And what evolution has done is it's created human minds and societies so that they create a meaning system. The raw process of evolution also creates meaning systems that basically result in a set of beliefs and practices which cause people to do the right thing in their respective environments. But the relationship between those beliefs and practices and any factual description of the world is a complex relationship, and often there's a steep trade-off, so that the belief that's factually correct, as a scientist or a rationalist would think of it, is not the belief that actually causes you to behave meaningfully and in a sustainable fashion in the world. A trade-off between what I call factual realism and practical realism. One of the reasons that new atheists love to hate religion is because they think that religions are full of these adaptive falsehoods. But I'm here to say that all meaning systems are full of those adaptive falsehoods, even the secular ones, not least the new atheists in their false statements about religion. So how do we actually manage, how does any meaning system manage the trade-off between factual and practical realism, knowing that in a modern age we need to respect the facts of the world more than ever before?
Yeah, then I would just add, in terms of some of the things that Ann was saying, in terms of theistic or spiritual but not religious, again, we're talking about boundaries and groups here. We're talking about, are you an atheist, or do you believe that there is a spirituality from which all of this emerges? What we like to focus on then, therefore, would be a trans-narrative approach, which simply says whether you're coming from an ethical narrative, or whether you're coming from a scientific narrative, or whether you're coming from a spiritual narrative, what is the space to which that narrative points? In your work, Dr. Wilson, you have this amazing pro-social network that has actually manifested action and therefore is making a big difference in the Binghamton community. And so you beautifully put in your book the comment that if Dr. Wilson is doing this from a standpoint of what some might call secular versus someone else is doing the same thing from a standpoint of what they call spirituality, his point in the book is, isn't that a bit like asking, do you want to be paid by check or cash? And I think this is another way that we break down the boundaries, because we're not trying to convert the atheist, and the atheist is not trying to convert us, because we are also people who have a different view of ultimate reality. But that we can actually come together in that same ultimate reality space when we're not in a conversion, rather we enter into a contributing way of looking at these problems.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
I
Please.
think your question is an intriguing one. I have a sense that we've underestimated the degree to which religious traditions have not merely been adaptive in the sense of contributing to pro-social behaviors for local groups, but that at some very profound level they've risen by a very complex series of processes, including contemplative disciplines, to non-localized modes of thinking that are genuinely ontological and metaphysical. And now we find that, for example, Buddhist notions of pradityasamutpada, that all things arise in dependence upon all other things, a fundamental metaphysical affirmation of Mahayana Buddhism, is the sort of thing you are articulating. So I appreciate, and I sense in your work that you are beginning to appreciate this, that religious traditions are not merely giving us instrumental narratives to motivate regionally successful adaptive behaviors, but they might actually, many of them, have arisen to genuinely generalizable intuitions about the nature of things that can be verified by other vocabularies.
So in some ways, science is playing catch-up in some
That's precisely.
in some respects. So much to talk about, but I got to get one more in here in our time. I invite you to do the following experiment. Use humanism as a search term for Google Images, and then evangelicalism as a Google search term, and then count the number of people in the images. If you do that for humanism, the modal number of individuals in the images will be 1. If you do it for evangelical, the modal number of images and of people in the images will be much greater than 1. And I think that we've all said, and I think it's true, that all of this has to come down to action, people doing things, and often doing things in groups. If it doesn't, then it's a failure in some sense. As the Bluegrass song puts it, if you don't love your neighbor, then you don't love God. And I think that there's differences in the degree to which these different meaning systems succeed, and that in some ways humanism can be faulted, as my little experiment demonstrates. And I worry about that category of people who declare that they're spiritual but not religious. I wonder if they're like an engine that's in neutral gear and is actually, what that means is that they don't belong to a formal religion. My question is, do they belong to any group?
This is why we, if I can
Sure.
respond to that, This is why we are saying to the spiritual but not religious group that the narratives, which have traditionally been interpreted as a religion, that the narratives can be interpreted as rather the evolution of spiritual consciousness, so that you get the structure of human evolutionary understanding of that which is ultimate reality, and the biblical narrative that is called God. So for myself and the things that we do, we're very deeply committed to the study of a narrative and the way that it acts in history and the implications and ramifications of it, so that we're tethered. We're not just floating in some general New Age, I don't know what it means. Really spiritual but not religious, in many cases, is actually spiritual because of religion. And so it's more of a reaction against something than it is something that they stand for. So I think narrative, again, I come back to narrative. I don't have to interpret a narrative as an identity, because when I attach to a specific narrative, then I have an I am statement. I am a, and I'll fill in the name of a religion or something like that. Now I've defined myself in terms of a group that stands in contrast to other groups. And so what we're saying is that we evolve. What if our I am statement has to do with we are all children of what we understand to be that ultimate reality?
I'd like to speak to this question as well, because when I contemplate this, what I see as the emerging global spirituality, this includes people who are deeply religious, who come out of a particular religious community. It includes humanists. It includes the nuns, the spiritual but not religious, and it also includes atheists.
Yes.
Because I really see something else happening that is beyond all of these separations. We are starting to agree on some very basic beliefs, actual hard and fast beliefs that we didn't agree on 20 years ago. This is new. And the whole idea of seeing the entire human family as an expression of the divine or the greater intelligence is a view of this emergent organism of humanity that is can finally see its home planet floating in space and have that sense that we are in fact one. And this is happening just at the moment when we're in this tremendous crisis. And I think that you're right in stating that that meaning is a big part of the crisis. You know, the crisis of meaning that the churches and the different religions provided an answer for when just how to survive was still the main objective of any person or family. And now we live in this world we're so distracted by so much complexity, but so many of us are living comfortably, not having to think about our immediate survival. We need the vision to pull us forward to this next stage of our evolution. I mean, this is what's lacking in our political process right now. And at a moment when every institution that humankind has built on the planet now is at the end of its paradigm and needs reimagining and to face a different world, to create from our deepest and highest potential a world that's very different from the way we're living now, that this common spirituality that's coming forward, where we truly see one another as equals in every sense of the word and can treat one another with respect and encouragement, that to me is the hope of humanity.
I was just sitting here thinking that, and I don't know if you agree with this, but that being born itself is an inclusion. It's one, and I think you touch on this very profoundly, it's one that is not easy to integrate and align to, because it creates a very great fear. As an example, we are small in greatness. And those sequences of fear prevent an illumination that is profound waiting to appear, which is that if we perhaps go beyond that fear, we see that it's actually a uniqueness to be here, and that belonging is the core of religion, to which all other religions have attempted to express in one way or another. So we are clearly at a phase where we're bound by fear into, what's the word you use, like enclosures, and yet the sequence hasn't really played out yet. So there are practical processes available to human life to re-enliven those sequences that have come to a stop, and that we can see, on the one hand, religion was a good attempt, on another hand, it saw it as a means of control to keep those sequences in place through fear. I think one of the responsibilities we have being here is to explore into the unknown of this, and not to keep telling each other the known. There are so many theories of what has happened, but beyond that truncation of that sequence are riches yet to be found. So when one approaches life from a fear, one tries to find an identity to handle it. But when one sees that life is the beginning, this is the beginning of life here. This is what makes this planet so unique. It is the starting point of life. So all these conversations about fracking and the balances of nature bring human life to beginnings. Everything that we are is waiting to be evolved. So I think that, maybe I'm too simple living on a Greek island, but I think that life itself is inclusion, and belonging is the first religious feeling that belongs, that is inherent in living. Now, maybe to adapt Ken Wilber's saying, it's not perhaps grow up, or is it wake up, grow up? It's wake up to grow up. That it's a sequence. And when I heard him say that, I just wondered what more might be fruitful in seeing that as we wake up, we grow up. And that the fears that we have, which perhaps we can even talk to each other about, not in emotional ways, but in very unique plasmas that allow us to go beyond it, may release a new part of the genetic of human life, which we're coded to unlock in our evolutionary consciousness. Yes.
I think very eloquent. Thank you very much. I think a point that it raises is that all species, including our species, is prepared for a range of conditions, from fear-inducing conditions to conditions of safety.
Yes.
And the human mind works very differently under those different systems. And so if you create an environment of fear, whether it's a psychological environment or a real-world environment, the human mind and the cultures created by that mind is going to be completely different than
and I think that we're all recognizing what you're saying as well, is that modern culture has become masters of fear.
Exactly. And of course, many cultures incorporate fear to chase you into a zone in which you feel safe. So that's part of the design of many cultures. So much to say. And so
I'll just say one last thing. I was in a taxi yesterday in New York, just a New York experience, and it said, if you assault this taxi driver, you will have 25 years imprisonment. And I hadn't even contemplated it before that
Oh, please, yes, more. We have 5 more minutes before I do my wrap-up, so...
Okay. I'll be brief. Another area of science that we found very helpful in humanism, and I would suggest that humanism is perhaps another one of those words, vocabulary, that you might want to go beyond a Google search, because there's a great deal of depth to the humanist philosophy and experience.
I just had to knock humanism sitting here in the Felix Adler Library.
Okay. Anyway, brain cognitive science, and we have learned so much from that. And when you talk about fear, Richard, that's something that I think the study of brain cognitive science and the understanding of how we have evolved as a species, and also how we develop as individual human beings, brings a lot to the table, brings a lot to our understanding of that. And so I've actually used that a lot, and I particularly appreciate Dan Siegel's book, Mindsight. He spoke here a few months ago, and the notion of if we are aware of how our evolution still has remnants in it in terms of our fear, the fight, flight, or freeze, then we can act in ways to change that. We can act in ways to be aware of it so that we can take that deep cleansing breath and choose to respond rather than to react. So I think that's one of the practices that we like to do here, and we like to learn about it. And again, being founded in science and not in not in something else.
I hear, though, Dr. Wilson asking a very concrete, practical question, and I'm not sure I heard the answer to, and that is, pro-social behaviors have to be practiced and brought to efficacy in actual groups of substantive scale so as to address planetary issues. And the question being asked is, where are there such groups among spiritual but not religious and the like? And I think at the very least this community here is an instantiation of a realization that one needs a group, not merely fancy theories or even persons in isolation meditating. And that's a very significant question for spiritual but not religious persons, and also for people who are, like me, members of traditional religious communities. My own sense is that something like the discipline of communities, together with accountability to other communities, is and other languages and other conceptual schemes is really important. So what I take my work to be about is a kind of cross-training in the disciplines and insights of more than just one tradition, while remaining more or less grounded in one. That is another way of addressing some of the scale problems, but there are people who just don't feel comfortable within any traditional religious community, and that is a reality, and I can't sort of wish that away. I can share in your worry as to whether persons who are so dissatisfied will come together in sufficient numbers to make a real difference. At present, it remains a hope rather than anything that I've seen evidence as actually occurring. And that's why I share your worry.
Yeah.
Well, just because you don't hear it doesn't mean it hasn't been said.
Well, not just said, but enacted.
No, enacted.
In action.
I give an example is that there's great meaning in being able to observe one's fears. And there's great meaning in being able to observe them in the safety of others who understand that observing it is to allay and neutralize its influence on the human race. And that was just one thing that was said, which is highly, highly practical. But I haven't read a book for 30 years. And maybe I shouldn't say that in this gathering. Science, we're looking at the science of the human, not the science of science. It's being spoken about right here, right now. There's attempts made by every person to come to terms with these very issues inside oneself. Finding exterior models can be useful, but only to find the sequence inside oneself. So yes, I wouldn't be honest to the purpose of this gathering, and of course that's a struggle too, because my well-brought-up Englishness would not want to confront anyone, and I hope you understand it's not you I'm confronting. It's that we don't create another myth between us, that there's nothing we're doing. We are doing great things together. And we're struggling to find the next bit together. And it's highly practical, highly practical. And I feel more honest to say that to you than to sit here and think about my ticket back to Greece.
I want to add one short thing to that, which is that the religions traditionally were the holders of meaning in society. And in our present society, we have many, many other ways that people are organizing for meaning. We see that at the United Nations in this just enormous expanding NGO community of people coming together to solve particular issues and move the conversation forward in various ways. And as Paul Hawken famously said, this is the biggest thing perhaps that's happening on planet Earth that hasn't become visible yet.
Yeah.
So I think people are organizing around meaning in tremendously altruistic ways, and that this is a very important factor in bringing us forward.
Yes.
Yep. Very
Great.
Very good.
Well, thank you so much. I think we've come to
So,
the end
do
of
I
this
have a,
panel.
Do I have a 5-minute wrap-up? Okay, good.
Wrap that up.
I know it. I'm selfish, basically. I get to talk more than the rest of you. So that is. So I want to actually begin by saying that, stressing that my book is just a teaser, basically, for so much that is happening now, and that's what makes it so exciting. Part of what's happening is just straight up in the biological sciences. Before we get to humans, what's taking place often under the name of the extended evolutionary synthesis. Straight up biological research is very reminiscent of what John and others were saying about just departing from this atomistic, reductionistic view to a more systemic view. And a lot of that has to do with like toppling the gene as like this centerpiece. It's not the case that the gene is a blueprint. The gene is a part of a developmental system. And so departing from that atomistic perspective, I think, is part of what's happening with the extended evolutionary synthesis. And then when we see the part of that extends to human evolution, it's very much what we're talking about, that an individual is born into a system in which basically they have so much that they need to acquire that adapts them to their particular circumstances, and that's the kind of creature we've evolved to be, genetically evolved to be, is the kind that where we get most of our practices from transmitted through a stream of cultural information, and so that there's a cultural stream of inheritance which goes along with the genetic, often in a somewhat uncomfortable way. So there's so much out there that when it comes to catalyzing, I think we need to catalyze this, just basically this fertile interchange of information, and the more we can do that, the more good comes from it. And that it does come down to action, and so there's some sense in which if we're not actually doing something in groups, then we haven't succeeded yet. I think that provides a great opportunity to move forward. And another point to make, a fundamental insight, is that the small group is a fundamental unit of human social organization. That is so different from the methodological individualism view, which holds that the individual is the fundamental unit. Think of all of the human origin scenarios from philosophers and so on, which basically imagine that we began as solitary creatures, and then, well, that's not remotely true. We began as social creatures. We are most at home in small groups that are doing things together. And I think a lot of what we associate with religion, actually, you get just by being in the community in a practical sense. So that is, so we need to basically function in small groups, but then those small groups have to be put together in a large society. A biological metaphor for that is multicellularity. We exist of trillions of cells that are working together to cause us to function as well as we do. Society needs to be like that. It's not individuals existing in large society, it's individuals existing in cells and various substructures that is required. And that biological metaphor dovetails with a concept that Eleanor and her husband Vincent Ostrom developed as polycentric governance. So we can actually work simultaneously at the global scale and at the local scale, and we need to do exactly that. So if this could result in not only the philosophically heady conversation that we're having, which is a delight just to have, but if it actually, we held ourselves to creating small groups, then those small groups would do two things well. One is it would lead to individual thriving, because individual well-being is the best in small groups of this sort. And those small groups are the ones that can establish the norms to actually walk the walk and do something together as a small group that an individual, no matter how well-meaning, and no matter how spiritual, in the absence of functioning in a group, will be unable to do on their own. So as we're beginning to frame it, thanks to Kurt, self-care, group care, earth care, with the group care being the central node, basically. Work on the groups, and then the self-care and the earth care will follow. So I think that's my wrap-up, and we have one more panel left in this wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for leading this panel, and thank you to all of you. Really an affirmation that something wonderful is unfolding just here, just between this small group, you know, for us to go forward together. Really a blessing to be a part of this today. And thank you for everything. I look
Great.
forward to the next panel.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.